Erev Tov L'Kulam. It is really a great privilege for me to be speaking on an honest reporting platform, since it's an organization whose work I admire so very much. And I am particularly honored that so many of you have turned out this evening to hear me. My title, as you can see, is The Jewish Diaspora Paying the Price for Gaza. Well, I am all too aware that the people who are paying the price for Gaza are here in Israel. And I just wanted to take a moment to think about those people. I'm sure all of us here watch these pictures with difficulty. Now, those of you who have perhaps been to the United Kingdom over the past few weeks to see friends or family probably know rather more about the state of community tension there than I do, because I've been here most of the summer. And despite all the rockets and the tension and the grief, and despite this ceasefire, which is actually a hudna, which can be broken at any time, it's entirely provisional on the Hamas side, and we don't know how long it's going to last. Despite all of that, I have to tell you it's such a relief to be here in this life-affirming place of hope, where Jews are not on their knees, but are fighting for the defense of civilization against barbarism. But before I came here for some respite from London in order to leap into my broom cupboard when the air raid siren goes off, I had the dubious pleasure of appearing on the radio, BBC Radio 4 show that I'm a regular panelist on, called The Moral Maze. And that particular show dealt with the Gaza conflict, and I think it was about a week, 10 days into the conflict. And on that show, we had on a professor of philosophy called Ted Honderich, who told me that he supported the Hamas, and his support for Hamas corresponded to what he called his principle of humanity. When I tried to read into the microphone several choice quotes from the Hamas Charter to illustrate quite what he was supporting, he told me he had no time for this right-wing rubbish. And one of my fellow panelists, an Anglican priest and a Guardian editorial writer, Giles Fraser, said with great emotion that he justified Hamas trying to kill Israeli civilians as resistance because Hamas had no alternative. Thus, the more elevated level of discourse in Britain about the Gaza conflict. Now, over the past few weeks, this anti-Israel attitude has morphed into overt anti-Judaism, which has seemed to roll across Britain and Europe and even parts of the United States like a kind of tsunami of bigotry and hatred. In Britain, the Tricycle Theatre effectively forced out the Jewish Film Festival from its usual venue by making a demand, which was rescinded after huge national protests, that the Jewish Film Festival should stop receiving a small donation from the Israel Embassy. Dozens of Sainsbury's stores and at least one Tesco were attacked by mainly Muslim, Gaza demonstrators who trashed their kosher food counters. They made the connection between Gaza and kosher food. Logical, isn't it? One Sainsbury's store in Holborn, in central London, was widely pilloried for clearing its kosher cabinet in anticipation of such an attack. And you can see what happened there when its staff rather ill-advisedly cleared its counter. In addition, we have seen free Gaza demonstrations which have spawned dozens of Hitler would be proud, Israel genocide, and other anti-Jewish and Holocaust-denying slogans. As we can see from these pictures, there are quite a lot of these demonstrations, and the bottom one says, "This is truly huge. Londoners show they're not happy about what's going on in Gaza." Meanwhile, attacks on British Jews, both verbal and physical, have gone up by something like 500%, I believe. You really do have to think, if you're a British Jew, you really do have to think now 3 or 4 times before coming out as a supporter of Israel. Because if you don't attack Israel for its behavior in Gaza, you too will be accused of tribal support for child killers. And of course, across the Channel, it's worse. In France, there have been anti-Jewish riots. Jewish-owned shops were torched in these riots. There were attacks on synagogues by demonstrators reportedly bent on murder. In Australia, 8 men got on a bus at Bondi carrying young Jewish children, and screamed, "Heil Hitler, kill the Jews, Palestine must kill you Jews, and we're going to cut your throats and slice your throats open." In Spain, 100 celebrities signed a letter accusing Israel of genocide. The chief rabbi of the Netherlands was attacked twice in 1 week, and just a couple of evenings ago, I read that a Jewish man and his wife were assaulted on New York's Upper East Side by men who then fled in cars flying the Palestinian flag. Well, in the diaspora, Jews are very frightened and very bewildered, as well they might be. We find in Britain that even our friends come out with Hamas propaganda, which they parrot from the TV news, about how Israel is willfully killing so many Palestinian children. It does seem to diaspora Jews, so many diaspora Jews, like the oldest nightmare has come back to haunt them. So what can we all do about it? Is it pointless to think we can do anything because what we're up against is anti-Semitism, and anti-Semitism is an irrational prejudice, and you can't deal with irrationality? Should Israel even be concerned about all this anti-Israel and anti-Jewish hatred convulsing the diaspora? Aren't Britain and Europe on their way out anyway? Well, I think we've got to first of all understand quite what we're dealing with, and it's a problem with, I think, 3 elements which are connected, but they are distinct. There is the Muslim problem, whose community, the Muslim community in Britain and Europe, is massively overrepresented in these violent attacks, particularly on the streets. Then the non-Muslim, indigenous British and Europeans are themselves a problem. And then the Israel and diaspora Jewish response is also itself a problem. So let's look at these things in turn. Let's look first of all at Muslim attitudes. Well, what's on display is what we know, that among Muslims there is a widespread hatred of Israel. There is a widespread prejudice towards and fear of Jews. Also, in the demonstrations on the streets, I believe that they are sending a wider message than one to Israel and the Jews. They're sending a message to Britain, to France, to European countries, that they are claiming the streets, they're claiming power over London, Paris, and these other cities. They have signature orchestrated slogans comparing Israel to the Nazis, the Israelis are child killers, and the patently ridiculous claim that the Israelis are committing genocide in Gaza. And the interesting thing about these claims, absurd and awful as they are, is that very often they are a projection of crimes of which they themselves are guilty or would want to be guilty: genocide, child killing, aggression. And this is how they also intimidate the West in general, through a kind of mind-bending projection and inversion onto other people of what they themselves believe and think and want to do. It's a kind of all a kind of variation on the underlying message, which goes roughly like this: if you tell us again that we're violent, we'll kill you. Now, this traditional hysteria among Muslims has been ramped up, not surprisingly ramped up, by these dreadful TV images broadcast night after night of dead Gaza children, and their perception, correct perception, that the non-Muslim population is very largely on their side and against Israel on this matter. So here's the next problem, the problem of the attitudes of the non-Muslim folk in Britain and Europe. Why is the Muslim story, the Muslim account of Israel being the aggressor rather than defending its people from murderous attack, why are the non-Muslims so receptive to that message? Well, part of the reason is traditional anti-Semitism, which goes across left and right, and is there, it's always there, and it's certainly on display now. But one has to ask why the so-called anti-racist, socially liberal, pro-gay rights left wing hate Israel, as they do, since Israel is the sole home in the Middle East of democracy, freedom, gay rights, rights for women, and all the rest of it. And I think this has several explanations. One is that on the left, there is this great desire to take up the cause of people fighting oppression. But only the West can be oppressive. Minorities cannot do wrong, and so the third world cannot be oppressive or aggressive. So the fact that most Muslims are murdered by other Muslims doesn't count at all. To the left, that is irrelevant. What matters is whether parties from the West are oppressing people who are not from the West. And after South Africa got rid of apartheid and Northern Ireland had the peace process and Catholics and Protestants are now in a power-sharing executive, there aren't many other Western oppressors left. So Israel has found itself lumbered with that role. And then one has to bear in mind the very important fact that in the 1960s, the newly formed Palestine Liberation Organization set out very deliberately to recast in the Western mind what was and is the Arab war against Israel, instead as a Palestinian struggle for liberation. And so there was a kind of romantic association between the men in keffiyeh and army fatigues. They were romanticized by an association with Ho Chi Minh, with Che Guevara, and here is the Palestinian face of the Palestinian resistance, Yasser Arafat, similarly immortalized on a T-shirt. So for people on the left in Britain and Europe, being hostile to Israel, hostility to Israel is the defining progressive cause. Then you also have to factor in the mindset that has taken over really both left and right, particularly in Britain, a mindset of moral relativism. There is no truth, there is no absolute right or wrong, everything is a matter of opinion. And at root, this abandons biblical-based morality for various ideologies which simply wrench the evidence, wrench the facts to fit the prior prejudice. So ideologies like multiculturalism, which have given rise to political correctness, the doctrine of moral equivalence, which says, to be fair, you must listen to grievances on both sides. So you must listen to the Hamas grievances as well as the Israel grievances. We're British and we're fair, and you have to listen to both sides. And if Israel doesn't have the same number of deaths as the Palestinians are having in Gaza, well, that's not fair, and therefore their response must be disproportionate. Now, to all of this kind of attitude, there is absolutely no chance of getting through at all, because it is basically irrational, and anti-Jew hatred is itself impervious to reason. And what I would call left-wing narcissism, which is the belief that, which is the fact that for left-wingers, what matters is not the position of Palestinians or people who are in dire straits, in poverty. What matters most of all is how they think of themselves as being nice people, good people, to themselves and to others. So left-wing narcissism means that since their entire moral personality is based on demonizing everyone who is not signed up to their false view of the world, they simply cannot tolerate any counter-argument which might fracture that moral personality. And the worst thing they can imagine of all, and I can tell you this because I've heard it said, the worst thing they can imagine, the worst fate for themselves they can possibly think of is to end up like me. But that's just the intelligentsia. I don't know if you can see the wording on this picture. The young girl on the right is saying, I'm a liberal, and he doesn't really mean that. And the man in the keffiyeh is saying, Islam demands death for homosexuals, no free speech, women stay home and submit to their husbands, death to all infidels. And the bottom says, liberals, they really are that stupid. Now, that's just the intelligentsia. The fact is, there are plenty of perfectly decent, rational people in Britain, and I'm sure in Europe, who aren't bad people at all. They aren't ideologues. They have their feet fairly firmly on the ground. but they really haven't got a clue what the true situation is here because the media doesn't tell them. So we have, on the one hand, we have the war, and then we have the media intifada. And there it is. This gentleman in the cartoon has a green bandana around his head saying world media. He is saying, this just in from Gaza. And we have, this is amusing, but it's actually true, because we have seen in the past few weeks in Operation Protective Edge a quite unbalanced and obsessional, malign coverage. At the very beginning, Israel was cut some slack. People said on the media and elsewhere, well, what would you do? And that struck a chord. What would you do, Britain, if you were under rocket attack from thousands of rockets? But then the pictures of dead children night after night began, and not surprisingly, people were enraged, disgusted, and horrified. But what they didn't realize they were getting from the media night after night and in the newspapers was a Hamas story. The Hamas casualty figures were repeated by the United Nations. These figures were presented as being representing, they were saying that the overwhelming majority of casualties in Gaza were civilians. This was accepted as axiomatically true. The links between the United Nations and the Hamas were not reported. The fact that Hamas was almost certainly lying was not reported. And so the impression was given almost without exception that Israel was disproportionately hurting civilians and killing children, even though, interestingly, Al Jazeera reported quite early on that couldn't be the case, since the majority of the people who'd been killed at that point in Gaza were reportedly men of fighting age. And since Gaza is made up of half of women and half of children under 18, it quite obviously wasn't the case that Israel was disproportionately killing civilians. There was no reporting of the use of human shields. There was no reporting of the firing of rockets next to schools and clinics. There was no reporting of the Hamas leadership hiding under the Shifa hospital, even though journalists, as far as I can see, were going in and out of the Shifa hospital interviewing them. There was no reporting. Now, why was that? Well, a clue came from the Foreign Press Association, not an organization normally friendly to Israel, which protested that journalists in Gaza were being and had been harassed and threatened by Hamas so that they couldn't tell the truth about what was going on. Whereupon some journalists who were in Gaza said, well, we never heard anything like this. We were never threatened. I was never threatened. Nobody ever told me what to write. Nobody ever threatened to lock me up or throw me out, so it can't be true. But of course, the explanation for why such journalists had never encountered such pressure was almost certainly because Hamas was absolutely delighted with their reporting. The real problem was not the journalists in Gaza, many of whom take tremendous risks and they're brave and they're working under terrible pressure. The real problem was their editors back home, the editors of the bulletins, the editors of the newspapers, who never said what they should have said. That this report from Gaza is produced under conditions of restriction, of censorship by Hamas. If people had heard that, they would have not believed that everything they were being told was the unvarnished truth. And only this week, I read a very interesting piece in Tablet magazine, online magazine, by a former Associated Press journalist, Matty Friedman, who wrote that in his day, and he said this is still the case, the Associated Press policy is not to inform readers that their story is censored unless the censorship is Israeli. Now, I would suggest that all this meant that the media became accessories, in effect. They became accessories to the Hamas war machine, and they can justly be accused of incitement to hatred and violence, because that's the effect they produced on the population. But the media are themselves merely a reflection of the wider culture in which Israel has been framed for years as the regional, indeed the global, bogeyman. In Britain, there have been repeated attempts by trade unions and universities and others to institute boycotts of Israel. Shops selling Israeli products are regularly demonstrated against, intimidated, and attacked. 3 years ago, the London shop Ahava shop in London's Covent Garden, selling cosmetic products which were somehow associated with the West Bank. Some of it was made there. That shop was shut down after repeated anti-Israel protests on the grounds that their products came from the occupied territories. 2 years ago, the Habima theatre production of The Merchant of Venice went ahead at London's Globe Theatre in a very ugly atmosphere in which the audience was forced to run a gauntlet of protesters after leading British actors and others called upon the theatre to withdraw its invitation to Habima so as not to be, quote, complicit with human rights violations and the illegal colonization of occupied land. And last Christmas, St. James's Church, Piccadilly, in the very center of London, manufactured, as you can see, a construction of, I think it was a wall, I think it was 8 foot high and 30 meters long, a replica of what they said was the wall around Bethlehem, the wall that encircled Palestinians in Bethlehem and made Arab lives a misery. Now, there was no mention of the fact that Bethlehem is not encircled by a wall. There was no mention of the fact that where it is a wall, it is only a wall at that part of Bethlehem because of the difficulty or the danger of that particular geographical part of the boundary of Bethlehem, the danger that if there wasn't a wall there, Israelis would otherwise be murdered. No mention of the thousands of lives saved by the security barrier. No mention that Bethlehem's Christians were have been driven out by the town's Palestinian administration. No mention that Israel is the only country in the Middle East where Christians are thriving and increasing. That wall stood up for about 10 days, a week, 10 days, during which there were events every day demonizing Israel as the oppressor of Palestinian Christians. So that's kind of a snapshot of some of the surrounding culture, but then you get to the fact that Israel has a problem with its ostensible allies, the British and American governments. And this is a very complicated thing indeed, because in both the United Kingdom and the United States, military intelligence, people and people in intelligence work very, very closely with Israel. Israel is regarded by people in intelligence and the military in both countries as having absolutely essential skills and experience which are useful to Britain and America in their own fight against Islamic extremism and terrorism. The United States and Britain both think that it's not just Israel's intelligence, but also it's not just its skills, it's not just its experience, but also a certain amount of hardware that Israel is manufacturing, which is eagerly snapped up in order to help defend Britain and America. And yet, the governments of Britain and America, while they are professing affection and support for Israel, simultaneously kick it in the head. And so we saw only recently President Obama threatened an arms showdown. The United Kingdom threatened an arms embargo against Israel if hostilities significantly escalated, which amounted to a threat that it would be punished for its own self-defense if Hamas really upped the rocket count. Britain has been a key mover in the European Union boycott of individuals and institutions over the Green Line, and both the United States and the United Kingdom are keen and enthusiastic promoters of a deal with Iran, a deal which tacitly accepts that Iran will continue to enrich uranium and therefore proceed to build its bomb. In Britain also, there have been a significant number of politicians, mainstream politicians, even though many of them are Liberal Democrats, and you might think they're not really mainstream, but anyway, I'm told that Liberal Democrats are mainstream. They are, in fact, part of the government. A series of mainstream politicians who've compared Israel to the Nazis, called Israel an apartheid state, or claimed that America is in the grip of an all-powerful and sinister Israel lobby. Some months ago, the former Labour Foreign Secretary Jack Straw reportedly said during a debate in the British Parliament that unlimited funds were available to Jewish organizations and AIPAC in the United States to control and divert American policy in the Middle East. And only in the last couple of days, another Labour Member of Parliament, Yasmin Qureshi, has compared joining the Islamic State militia to joining the IDF. Now, much more important than this is what I would call the sustained malice of President Obama towards Israel. He claims to have Israel's back, but I think it's more like a knife in the back. The Obama administration has fairly consistently been leaking and briefing against Israel, bullying and threatening it into making concessions to Mahmoud Abbas, while overlooking Abbas's own intransigence, incitement, and statements that the Palestinians will never, ever accept Israel as a Jewish state. President Obama is cozying up to Iran, Qatar, and Turkey, who fund, arm, and train the enemies not just of Israel, but the West. Now, there is absolutely no question that the animus against Israel has gone into a different gear with openly anti-Jewish attacks. But the response by both the diaspora and the outraged non-Jews to this open anti-Semitism, I would suggest, is also deeply problematic. Why were they so surprised when people were on the street saying Hitler was right? Why were they so surprised that people were making the connection between Israel and Judaism? And they were surprised because both non-Jews and Jews, in their own mind and for different reasons, have made a separation between Jewishness and Israel. Non-Jews have claimed consistently that in hating Israel, of course that doesn't mean that they hate Jews. They love Jews. Jews are among their best friends. And you don't have to be an anti-Semite to hate Israel after all. Plenty of Jews don't like Israel too, they say. And British Jews have I think for the most part, concurred by keeping quiet about Israel, keeping their heads down, as you can see, or even agreeing that there would indeed be peace on earth if only Bibi Netanyahu were basically to lose power. The attacks on Israel per se didn't particularly concern them. Why should these attacks concern British Jews as long as they kept their heads down, safely ensconced in their trenches? And there was virtually no protest when the Ahava shop was forced to shut. There was no protest when the Edinburgh Festival barred recently participation by Israeli fringe theatre troupes. Even the boycotts of Israeli academics or trade unionists or products sourced from the disputed territories, if they are condemned at all, they are criticized, generally speaking, on safe grounds, such as the absurdity of denying free speech to people who criticize Israel, or the absurdity, and worse, of denying employment to Palestinian workers who were working for Ahava. But when kosher food or the Jewish Film Festival is targeted, everyone becomes hysterical. First they came for the pickled cucumbers, you might say. Next they'll come for me. That seems to be the general line. But it's very striking because the anti-Israel campaign is surely wrong in and of itself because it is based on singling out Israel for double standards, an obsessive campaign of falsehoods and demonization designed to delegitimize and destroy it. In other words, Israel is being treated as the Jew of the world, and anti-Semitism is at the heart of that particular animus. It lies also at the very core of Arab rage against Israel. It's why Europeans find themselves marching with Hamas supporters. Yet, British Jews are outraged at suddenly finding themselves the targets after all that effort they've been to in trying to pretend that Israel was really nothing to do with them. Well, should this actually matter to Israel? I have to say there's a certain amount of schadenfreude here, a kind of grim satisfaction that sooner or later British Jews will be forced to leave, people are telling me all the time. So, is that the case? Do the Jews of Britain and elsewhere really need just to lie in the bed they've chosen to make for themselves? Are Britain and Europe over anyway? Are they going to be submerged by Islamization? Have they lost the plot in terms of their economy? They've lost the will to live as nation states? Well, this is an unanswerable question. It is possible that it is over and that Europe will, in a few decades, cease to be recognizable as the Europe we know. But it's also possible that Europe will fight back. And there are some signs that it is beginning to think about doing so. If it does fight back, I suspect that again, Jews will probably find themselves, unfortunately, caught in the middle. But if Britain and Europe carry on as they have been, it is hard to see how they can survive as Western countries we now recognize. It's true that there is now an opportunity because the Islamic State militia has spooked Britain in a way that it wasn't spooked before. The horrific beheading of James Foley on video has really got to people in Britain. And this is a little surprising because it was only perhaps a year ago that an off-duty soldier, Lee Rigby, was hacked to death and almost beheaded in broad daylight on the streets of South London. And people were horrified by that, and he was hacked to death by, I think it was 2 Muslim converts, and people sucked their teeth and said, and then they kind of forgot about it. But the murder of James Foley has got to people, and consequently, the Prime Minister, Mr. Cameron, is under some pressure to do something, to rescind the passports of the hundreds of British Muslim boys who our intelligence service tells us have gone to join up with the IS in Iraq and Syria. And indeed, Boris Johnson, who last year told me and the nation that there was no need to worry about Iran because Iran posed no threat to anyone in the world, Boris Johnson was so moved by the murder of James Foley that he has now said that the presumption of innocence should be reversed. Anyone at all who goes to Iraq or Syria should be presumed to be guilty of being a jihadi and have to prove their innocence. So there is a certain amount of ferment going on in Britain over all of this. But nevertheless, there is still a refusal, I would suggest, by British politicians to accept the true nature of the Islamic Jihad, the true nature of the threat to the West, because they deny that they deny it as a religious war, and they deny that it's got anything to do with Islam. After the horrific beheading of James Foley, possibly at the hands of a British IS recruit, the United Kingdom Foreign Secretary Philip Hammond, and this is he, said that the Islamic State's regime of torture, arbitrary punishment and murder went against the most basic beliefs of Islam. Yvette Cooper, Labour's Home Affairs spokesman, said the IS embodied, quote, perverted ideology that bears no relation to Islam. She's also in the picture wearing a suit. President Obama said the IS speaks for no religion. Their victims, he said, are overwhelmingly Muslim, and no faith teaches people to massacre innocents. He's right at the back. I would suggest, ladies and gentlemen, that if Obama, Hammond, and Cooper had been around at the time of the Spanish Inquisition, they would undoubtedly similarly have claimed at the time that the Pope wasn't really a Catholic. So I would say that diaspora Jews are not paying the price for Gaza. They're paying the price for living in societies which, about to go over the edge of the cliff, recognize neither that they are even on a cliff, nor that there are sharks circling in the sea below. Now, all this should matter to Israel. This public animosity and refusal to accept reality, this kind of derangement of mind in Britain and Europe, may or may not result in economic or other boycotts of Israel. But nevertheless, it has the capacity, as we have already seen, to put political pressure on politicians to withdraw support for Israel. Now, what should Israel's response be? Well, first let me say that I think that some of the officials working for the Israeli government are absolutely splendid and magnificent and do a tremendous job in really, really difficult circumstances. When the demagogic Bradford MP, George Galloway, declared Bradford was an Israel-free zone, the Israel ambassador to the United Kingdom, Daniel Taub, went to that city and unfurled an Israeli flag right next to the Welcome to Bradford sign. And what a magnificent sight that is. But however good such officials may be, they are limited, I would suggest, by Israel's failure to grasp that information is a strategy of war on the battleground of the mind. and a strategy that has been used to enormous effect against Israel, and against which it doesn't even seem to know that it is fighting. Israel needs a new strategic vision. It needs to have a strategy to combat the psychological warfare strategy being deployed by the enemy and having been deployed so effectively against Israel for around 4 decades now. Israel needs a strategy for fighting this. It needs to get off the back foot onto the front foot and reframe the entire narrative about the Middle East. It needs to do it, I would suggest, in 3 particular ways. It needs to educate the uneducated, it needs to delegitimize the delegitimizers, and it needs, perhaps most important of all, it needs to position Israel at the forefront of the global battle for civilization. Let's look at these briefly in turn. Educating the public. This should include educating the public in the history of Jews and of Israel. I think it's one of the great sadnesses of recent years, the great mistakes that was made, that people were understandably very concerned that children should be taught about the Holocaust. What they didn't realize is that if you tell people about the Nazis and you tell people about the terrible depths of depravity and brutality and inhumanity to which people can sink, I'm afraid the conclusion that can be drawn is that that can actually happen to anyone. And it has been drawn, and Israel is now being accused of that very thing. And the problem is that we have not taught our children what Israel's history is, what Jewish history is. And so the public, even the well-meaning public, really hasn't got a clue that it is Israel, that it is the Jewish people who have the rights here. We should be telling the world, Israel should be telling the world, that it is Israel which has justice and truth on its side. It should be telling the world the history of the last century and before that, so that people come to understand that the Jews are the only people who have an entitlement to this land based on the fact that it was the national kingdom of the Jews for hundreds of years, centuries before Islam was invented and the Arabs invaded. It should make people aware that as long ago as the 1920s, the international community acknowledged that fact and decided, therefore, that the Jews alone had the right to be settled in that land from the river to the sea. They should be told that Palestinian identity is an artificial construct invented solely in order to exterminate the legitimate claim of the Jews, the historic, legal, legitimate claim of the Jews to the land of Israel. I can assure you that people in Britain have not a clue about this. They think that Israel was formed as a result of European guilt over the Holocaust, as a result of which European Jews with no connection to the land of Palestine, which had been settled for centuries by indigenous Muslims, and it was their country, that the European Jews were plonked in the middle of this land from which they drove out those indigenous Arabs and are continuing to do so. And that's what even well-meaning people think in Britain. Such is the state of ignorance. Israel also should be showing the world the reality of Muslim anti-Semitism. You've only got to go to the Palestinian Media Watch website to see how the so-called moderate Palestinian Authority presents Jews as inherently treacherous, corrupt, deceitful, and unfaithful, said to be planning and executing heinous crimes, including burning Palestinians in ovens, murder, using their prisoners for Nazi-like experiments, and more, and including medieval blood libels. And that's the moderates. Israel should also be reclaiming the word Zionist for the moral high ground where it belongs. People have come to think of the word Zionist as synonymous with fascist or Nazi or apartheid. People need to be taught that Zionism is simply self-determination. And I think they have to be taught something even more controversial, and it will be controversial in the Jewish community too. Judaism is a kind of three-legged stool. It consists of the people, the book, and the land. Those 3 legs are fundamental to Judaism. Take one away and the thing collapses. It's perfectly true. So it's perfectly true, as people will immediately say, but some Jews are not Zionists, so that can't be right. Well, so what? Some Jews don't keep Shabbat. that doesn't mean that Shabbat is not intrinsic to Judaism. And it's the same with Israel. To be hostile to Israel or Zionism is to be hostile to Judaism. And that's what has to be rammed down people's throats. Then we have to delegitimize the delegitimizers. And I'm afraid there are many delegitimizers, including people who purport to be neutral or even the allies of Israel and the Jewish people. The first and most important delegitimizer who has to be delegitimized is the United Nations. This has to be called to account. Israel shouldn't be sitting way-facedly twisting its hands, worrying about the UN's ridiculous commission of inquiry into whether Israel alone has committed war crimes in Gaza. Israel should already have seized the initiative. It should already have made the claim, made the complaint, made the accusation that the UN cannot possibly have any legitimacy because the UN Relief and Works Organization, UNRWA, is hand in glove with Hamas, and that this is an absolute negation of the UN's founding values. Israel should be helping launch an independent commission of international lawyers and jurists to investigate the complicity of UNRWA with Hamas, and it should be asking why the world invests the UN with any authority at all when the UN's Human Rights Council is a mechanism for empowering dictatorships and rogue states which are in the business of extinguishing freedom and human rights. Why isn't Israel doing this already? Israel should be calling its allies, the British and other governments, to account for their silence, their astonishing silence over the years in the face of the sustained demonization of Israel, the sustained falsehoods, the sustained distortions, and the consequent incitement against Israel and Jews. It's happening all the time. It's astounding to me that successive British prime ministers have not said to the people of Britain, you're being told lies, this is not true. But they've never said that, and if they said that, the situation would change virtually overnight. Israel should be telling the united government, furthermore, that it is complicit in this incitement by itself making false claims that its settlements are illegal, and even, I've heard the Foreign Office say, it is still in occupation in Gaza. I once phoned the Foreign Office and asked them why they said this, and they said, well, everyone knows that to be true. Israel should explain why its control over the disputed territories is entirely legal, which, as far as I can see, is so at least twice, if not 3 times over. Israel should be accusing the United Kingdom government for incentivizing Hamas and punishing Israel for defending its citizens by having threatened its arms embargo on Israel if significant hostilities resume. It should be asking why Britain and America have uniquely incentivized aggressors in the Middle East by rewarding, ignoring, or sanitizing Arab aggression against Israel. From 1936 to this day, when the British first came up with a 2-state solution, when it wanted to divide the land in order to pacify the Arabs by giving the Arabs part of what the international community has said was the entitlement of the Jews, from that time to this, they have been offering bits of what the Jews are entitled to in the land in response to exterminatory terrorist atrocities. Well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand that if you reward terror, you get more terror. That's been going on for decades. Why doesn't Israel ever say this? Why doesn't Israel ever ask Britain, America, Europe, its so-called allies, why its so-called allies, why the so-called civilized West, is treating the Middle East conflict in a way that it doesn't treat any other conflict, in which it looks at people who have been engaged in a campaign of extermination for decades, and it puts pressure on their potential victims to make compromises. Why is it being treated why is it being singled out in this way? The question should be asked. If the question was asked, people would start to think about that question and would come up with some very interesting answers. It should also be asking why the West is forcing Israel to negotiate with those who are currently teaching their children to hate and to murder Jews. It should be asking why the United Kingdom and the EU are active accessories to this incitement by funding the Palestinian Authority, which is behind it. It should be asking why all these people are silent over the anti-Semitism rampant in the West, in the Muslim world, which is pushing the aggressive war against Israel and the West. And it should be asking Western progressives, calling them to account for why they are backing what is basically racist ethnic cleansing in a future state of Palestine, which would have no Jews in it. When you ask a Western leftist why he or she is backing this racism, I can tell you the reaction is quite seismic. They are astounded. No one's ever made them think of this before because no one has ever brought these facts to their attention. So the final and most important aspect of this reframing of the narrative, I would suggest, is to present Israel's fight as not simply a regional conflict, but as putting it at the head of the global fight for civilization. People have got to be made to understand that Israel's fight is the fight being waged by Britain and the West for Western civilization, for freedom against religious fascism, that we're all in this together. Israel should be explaining something which the British government doesn't seem to understand, nor does the American administration, the Obama administration. The Israelis should be explaining to the public at large, to the world at large, how Hamas, Hezbollah, the Islamic State, the Muslim Brotherhood, how these people are not just free-floating radicals who kind of emerge from time to time out of a primeval swamp. They are backed by states such as Qatar, Turkey, and Iran, which happen to be supported at the moment by the United States. All these states, Qatar, Turkey, Iran, they're not just a threat to Israel. They're responsible for attacks on numerous Western interests. Israel should be explaining to people who have just about got their heads around the fact that Islam is divided into Sunni and Shia, and they both hate each other, and consequently, because they both hate each other, they can't ever be in alliance with each other. Israel should be explaining that's actually not true. That's not how the Middle East works. It's not how the Arab and Muslim world works, and that both Sunni and Shia, represented by Iran and by Saudi Arabia and by Iran, are united in a war on the free world. And they should explain, Israel should explain how a victory for Hamas in Gaza is a victory, would be a victory for those Western enemies, and how a defeat for Hamas in Gaza would make the West stronger. It should also share with the British and European public the advice it is giving the United Kingdom about dealing with Islamic holy warriors, because it should be giving people the correct impression that Israel and Britain and America are fighting the same kind of enemy and Britain and America are reliant upon Israel's skill and expertise and experience in helping Britain and America deal with this. People in Britain have not a clue that this is going on. Why isn't Israel telling us all this? It should set out quite why Israel is so vital for Western defenses and what would happen to the West if Israel were to lose. Someone made this analogy the other day, and I thought it was so frightening and so good. They said, what people in the West don't understand is that the Islamists are about infiltration. That is their strategy. And just as we can now see how they are infiltrating into Israel by building physical tunnels from Gaza into Israel and possibly in the north and possibly from Syria, who knows? But they're building tunnels and up they pop. They are suddenly, to our horror, amongst us. That's what they're doing in the West, not through physical tunnels, but through cultural infiltration. Suddenly, they're amongst us, and suddenly we can't resist them. And it's the same strategy. And that has to be brought home to people in Britain and Europe, that we are all in this together. And finally, I would say in this discussion about how to reframe the narrative of the Middle East, one has to ask, I've made a few suggestions about what I think Israel might do. Is Israel likely to do any of this? Am I being realistic in thinking that possibly someone might be listening and thinking, you know what, she's got a point? I'm afraid I think there's no prospect of that whatsoever. You can't even get off the starting block here to do with the levels of incompetence and arrogance and ignorance, the turf wars between the foreign ministry and the prime minister's office, it's pretty hopeless. And Israel also makes another point when one says this to them, the Israeli officials, Israeli government people, they say, this is completely unrealistic. You are asking us to upset the entire diplomatic apple cart. You're asking us to insult our allies. We can't possibly do that without Britain, without America, without Europe. We wouldn't have anybody. Well, the result of that is that Israel has been for years prevented from defending itself adequately by those allies who say, yes, we're going to sell you lots of arms on the basis that you don't really use them to kill anybody. The fact is that Israel should have more confidence. Israel is a strong country. In fact, some people think, you know, you look at these great empires, the European civilization, look at the demography, it's going off the cliff. Look at the Islamic world, despite its aggression. Look at its demography, it's going off the cliff. Look at the economies of these countries, not happy. Look at their general well-being, they're very miserable. There's only one country, it seems to me, where the economy is booming, where people have hope in their hearts, where people are having lots and lots and lots of babies, and it's here. And so Israel is a strong country. It is soon going to be, as I understand it, self-sufficient in gas. It will soon start exporting gas. I think it's already exporting gas. It has expertise which Britain and America and Europe are queuing up to get in relation to the war, in relation to militant Islamism. Britain and the Americans and the Europeans need Israel, and that gives Israel leverage, and it should use it. It should use it in the bully pulpit of public opinion at the very least. So, to come to my conclusion, I would say that diaspora Jews are not paying the price for Gaza. Israel has paid the price for Gaza, and although we all hope that this ceasefire augurs peace, I'm afraid it may be peace in our time, and I'm afraid that we may find the conflict continues. Israel is paying the price for Gaza. The diaspora Jews are paying the price for something else. Diaspora Jews are paying the price for European and Western anti-Semitism. They're paying the price for Israel's strategic failure on the battleground of the mind. They're paying the price for their own silence and their own futile attempt to separate themselves from Israel. They are paying the price above all, and I'm thinking particularly of Britain, for living in a fool's paradise. We are undoubtedly dealing with something overwhelming and mad. There's no question about that. It's a kind of global derangement. I've described it elsewhere as a metaphysical psychosis. Israel is being used as a lightning rod in Britain and Europe for a number of things. A rage at the Jews for commandeering the status of victimhood and making other people feel there's no space for any other suffering because the Jews will always somehow trump it. Rage at the Jews for claiming this unique victim status, which makes it impossible to voice the dislike of Jews, which is the normal order of things. The displaced guilt in Britain and Europe at the Shoah, in which all of European society was more or less complicit. In Israel, we say, never again will Jews go meekly to the slaughter. In Britain and Europe, they say never again. Never again will Jews be allowed to be victims, to pretend to be victims. If they can be represented as Nazis, if they are themselves guilty of genocide, if that accusation can be made to stick, then their own victimization, the victimization of the Jews at the hands of real Nazis conducting a real genocide, can be erased, and the guilt of Europe can be erased with it. So also, I believe the hatred of Israel, strong, booming, proud Israel, is also a projection of particularly British and European rage at what Europe and the West perceives it has become, purposeless, identityless, and mired in national self-disgust. So why should we fight the animus against Israel? It might do some good. I think it would actually do a lot of good. But even if its effects are minimal, even if the forces of unreason are too overwhelming, We fight for truth and decency and justice because we are Jews, because we have a duty to do so, a duty to fight lies and injustice and abuses of power, a duty to record the evidence of whatever is happening, a duty to make a stand for what is right. In the end, we fight this because we must. Thank you again for having me.